Khumalo.
Last time on exploring Khumalo, we got absolutely wrecked by an Wekundu deck because we weren't running any restricted cards. We barely needed Employee Strike to place early pressure, and more importantly, we found that even though we managed to set up eventually, we didn't really get into our stride because we were running too few viruses to justify running Khumalo as an ID ability. Having talked to James Gray, who has played a lot of Freedom Khumalo, he basically said that there was only one good reason to play Khumalo, and that is the consume combo with Imp. So if you don't have that engine, there's no point to play Khumalo. Well, I think there's another reason to play Khumalo, and that's the Lamb Yusuf combo. We've explored this previously using this deck, and we found that there was some cards that were underperforming, like security testing. Now that clone chip is off the most wanted list, we have a whole new possibility of revisiting this deck. With clone chip in our deck, this means that we can resort to other means of drawing cards that put programs in our bin. Previously, we were very scared of putting programs in our bin. But now with Clone Chip, we can play cards like Inject and Street Peddler that allow us to recur these set programs that were milled. And this also allows us to not play self-modifying code because we are using much stronger draw cards in our deck. So we are going to give this a whirl once again. It's mostly similar to the previous Lamb deck, but now with an Employee Strike. And now with Clone Chip, things should become more interesting. This is going to be a double whammy. We are going to be playing 2 sets of games. So let's get into the games right now. Alright, today we are up against NZK's Palana, atypical Palana deck. Now, I call it atypical. We'll see why that is the case as the game unfolds. But first, we have to decide to keep or mulligan. Here, we choose to keep because we have a pretty good opening line. We can always sure gamble into Liberator account. That's a very good way to start the game. It also allows us to have 2 clicks remaining to run archives and then play Mining Accident. Mining Accident obviously most ideal on turn 1 because they typically don't have the cash up front to be able to afford the 5 credits from Mining Accident. Bad publicity is very important in this deck because we'll be using Lamb's barrier conversion ability a lot, because after that we'll then use Yusuf to break the now newly converted barrier. So because of that, we want to be able to get up to 1 or ideally 2 bad publicity so that we can use Lamb's conversion ability for free every single run. Our opponent here chooses not to pay the 5 credits, instead taking the bad publicity because they wanted to play the hedge fund. Alright, so that's fine. Interesting though, because I think they top decked the hedge fund. Otherwise they would have played it on the first turn. Now they start constructing the remote, and this is where Palana really shines. They can typically at this point jam an agenda, but instead they're not going to advance anything in the remote. They're just never advancing it. We could attempt to run it, but I don't really feel like doing so. They're very rich and I'd rather set up. Look at my hand, it's too beautiful to give up to net damage at this point. With another Mining Accident ready to fire and a Yusuf ready to get virus counters, we are going to run archives and hit another Mining Accident. Even though this brings us down to 0 credits, it massively slows down our opponent as they are forced to keep up by paying the 5 credit tax. So because of that, they are still not scoring out, which is a really good thing. Even though they've gotten a Rashida trigger. Usually as a Rush Corp, you want to get your first agenda, ideally the Nisei Mark II, out as soon as possible when the runner still hasn't found all their breakers yet. Like right now, I could never ever contest that remote because I don't have Lamb to deal with quote gates or sentries, and even if they were all barriers on the remote, with only 1 virus counter on Yusuf, I just can't run it. So being able to buy time to set up is really good here as I find my daily cast and install it right before my opponent hits me with a scarcity of resources. So they did override my Employee Strike, which was doing some work, preventing them from firing their ID ability. Scarcity quite does a lot of work against my Khumalo deck, a lot of resources in my deck. So I'm not happy to see that, which is why I'm gonna start pressuring HQ. Khumalo always wants to be running HQ anyway to destroy cards from hand, but there's an additional impetus here because I want to steal an agenda to get rid of scarcity of resources. Obviously, your opponent's current is trash if you steal an agenda yourself. Now, here's the tricky part though. I know that it's a Jinteki deck. I know they're probably running Obo Carter protocols. So what I really should be doing here is to draw up to 4 cards before making the HQ run. I need to always be able to steal Obo Carter protocols. The worst thing is hitting an Obo Carter and not having the 4 cards to pay for it. Then it's a wasted run. The reason I didn't do that was because we actually had this same matchup earlier. I played a game with NZK before this where he utterly, completely, totally wrecked me. Because I was just playing very badly. But during that game, I found out that they were running, among other cards, Fairchild 3. Now, I mean, this is something I should be learning. Fairchild 3 is obviously a really good piece of ice and should be expected in most Glacier decks, along with, Surveyor as well. But Fairchild 3, a wonderful alternative to Surveyor if you need the restricted slot for something else like Obo Carter Protocol. So I should always be expecting it. And because of that, we always want to be running first click, because we need to be able to click through Fairchild 3. Otherwise, it will do some really nasty stuff to us. Alright, so this is why I'm running first click, even though it means I can't steal in Obo Carter. But now I'm going to get punished for not having the correct breaker out. Anansi is res against me, which deals 4 net damage, so I will barely scrape by. But at the cost of having to pay 2 credits for the second subroutine to fire. I need to draw an extra card so that I can soak up the 4 net damage from Anansi. Now we access HQ. This does a couple of things. It gives us a Yusuf counter, but more importantly, we get the all-important access. It's not an agenda, it's a Marcus Batty. Now we know that we are not going to run for the rest of the turn, even though we have 3 clicks left and our opponent is rather poor. We really cannot afford to run into any source of damage at all. It will just kill us. Our remaining clicks are going to be spent drawing up. So because of that, we won't be using Khumalo's ability anymore this turn. Might as well use it to trash Marcus Batty, saving us 1 credit. We inject into a bunch of really good cards here, one of which is our draw card Peddler. Unfortunately, Street Peddler is affected by the scarcity tax, so it's not a very good install at this point in time. We're going to play the Sure Gamble next turn as our opponent installs double advances in the remote. Okay, what do we do here? As I mentioned, we can't really afford to contest the remote. We are just not in a good position to do it. But we notice that they are only on 4 credits. So the remote is almost certainly NGO front, right? If you do a cost-benefit analysis, if it is an NGO front, which it is 90% of the time, you are going to, lose a lot if you run into something big like a DNA tracker or Chiashi, which they will have exactly enough money to res. So we don't really want to run this server. In fact, we can do something really interesting. I like to call it the switch and bait. Basically, we are going to divert our attention to another server in order to perhaps induce them to use their NGO front. So basically, review the identity of the card in server 1 without actually running that particular server. We can focus our attention on R&D instead. Depending on whether they choose to res or not res the R&D ice, we can make further deductions of the identity of the advanced card in server 1. So we're gonna do exactly that. We first take some money and then run R&D again. Again, this is not very good behavior. I should be drawing up to 4 cards so that I can steal Obo Carters. But I just really wanted to run early on in the turn so that I can make deductions of what my opponent's the identity of the card in server 1. Here you saw they chose to not rest the ice on R&D. Additionally, they took a while to you can't really see that, but in the actual game they took a while to think about whether they wanted to rest the ice. So because of that, I've enough reason to believe that it's an NGO front, and they were, they could be bluffing. It could be a double mind game, but probably they were thinking, is it worth it to rest the NGO front and use the newfound money to rest the R&D ice? They decided it wasn't worth it. So we're going to access an envelope here. Good to know what their barriers are. Yusuf will make very short work of envelope, so we're not too worried about that. We drop to 4 and end our turn. We are starting to draw a lot of resources here. So the street peddlers are really not very playable given scarcity lock. So we are not very happy about that. We do have lamb in the bin and we do have a clone chip. So it's important to note that we can actually break non-barriers at this point in time. The only thing I'm really looking for right now is a knife because I really want to knife the Anansi on HQ. So we are in a tricky spot here because given that our opponent did not res the R&D ice last turn, I would usually just rerun R&D here. It must mean that they are not very happy with the R&D ice. However, since they double ice R&D, running R&D is probably not going to work out. We probably won't be able to get through both R&D ice here. Or can we? We do know they recently drew an envelope, so the outer R&D ice is almost certainly an envelope. Anyway, we are going to run server 1 here. Knowing that Fairchild 3 is one of their stopper ice since it has ended the run, we can possibly triple click through the Fairchild 3 if they have one on the server. Otherwise, we're just going to waltz through and we can break one of any ice since we have lamb in the bin. It's going to cost us half our cash, half our bank, but we need to start running server 1, force them to res some ice and see what's in the remote. We don't really want to give them another Rashida, so we see Susano no Mikoto here. Right, this is effectively a stopper ice and we don't really have a good solution for it. Our best bet, since we don't run David, is to use Lamb. This is going to be bloody expensive. 7 credits to break a 9 res cost Susano. And to make things worse, we are going to lose a Batty side game here. This is unfortunate. Susano triggers and the rule is I cannot jack out until encountering the next piece of ice. If there's no ice on archives, we have to carry on anyway and make a successful run on archives. It's not a bad thing. We are getting a free Yusuf counter. We take those, but we also take the 2 breach domes in the bin. Oh gosh, yeah, this deck got real spicy right there. I wasn't expecting the breach domes. That took a lot of hit points out of my deck, which I'm not happy about. At least it gives me the central run trigger, so I'm going to be able to play my last mining accident here, and they have to really think very carefully about whether to use take the bad pub or not. They choose not to take the bad pub. Right, seeing how often I've been making runs during this game, my opponent made the smart choice to spend the 5 credits to avoid taking the bad publicity. Even if server 1 is an agenda, they know full well that I won't be able to penetrate through because Susano no Mikoto is such a big cock block. So good on them. I think they made the right play here. And the game continues. Now, they are now pretty poor, so this is a very good time to run R&D, knowing that they probably can't res both of the ice there. We first meet in an IP block. We were expecting an envelope, but IP block's just fine as well. Same thing, only 2 virus counters to get through, and we see a corporate sales team. Oh yeah, oh yeah, yes. So happy to see that, so happy. Right, the biggest thing here, scarcity goes down. We can now play the resources from our hand. Turning Wheel and Daily Cast had better hit the table before my opponent plays a second scarcity. So I immediately take a credit, drop 2 resources on the table, both of which are very important. Turning Wheel is going to be my main win condition on centrals, while Daily Cast is very important for recovering my money after that very expensive remote run. Breaking that Susano no Mikoto was a huge deal. Alright, we draw into our knife here. This is wonderful. Knife. I'm definitely looking at knifing the Anansi on HQ in very soon. It's a very big piece of ice. I don't like dealing with it. What better way to get rid of it than to knife it? I'm not exactly in the position to do it right now, however. I need 7 credits to use Lamb. That's the magic number. For those of you who are not familiar with Lamb stats, that's 2 to convert it to a barrier, 3 to pump strength, and 2 to break all subroutines, for a total of 7 credits. I don't have 7 yet. I only have 5, 4 plus 1 bad pub, and I won't be able to get 7 credits in time. Plus 1 actually, I need to pay 1 credit for the knife. So I can only do it next turn. So obviously the rest of my turn is going to be click, click, credit. Next turn, my very first click is going to be knife HQ, and then I'm just going to run HQ 3 times to get Yusuf counters and to, plink all agendas from my opponent's hand. My opponent saw the knife. It was reviewed by Inject. So they know that a knife is coming their way, and they know that the most vulnerable ice is the Anansi on HQ. So they made a very, very smart call here to put an ice on HQ. This really deters me from using the knife here. Yes, because firstly, the knife could possibly be soaked up by the outer ice, which is, you know, your main target is the Anansi, not the outer ice. The second problem is I probably will not have enough money or resources to break both Anansi and the outer ice, right? Because I can only convert one of them to barrier in a turn, because I only have one lamp out. So I really had to think very hard about this. Do I follow through with my knife plan? Taking a risk on the outermost ice? I chose to in the end, going with 9 credits on the off chance that the outermost ice is a barrier. Right, if it's a barrier, I can potentially break it with lamb for 2 credits. If it's anything but a barrier, I am in trouble. Yeah. So my opponent reviews the envelope here that was drawn off R&D earlier. So that's a wonderful sight to see. It means that we don't need to use lamb for the outer ice. And the best part about envelope is that the first subroutine that does 1 net damage actually works in our favor. If this were a vanilla, a single subroutine ice that, or any ice that only ends the run, we would be forced to break all subroutines on the barrier in order to proceed into the Anansi. And by breaking all subroutines, knife will trigger on the outer ice. Here we have the option to only break the end the run subroutine, let the net damage subroutine fire, even though we don't want to take net damage now. By doing so, we do not break all subroutines on envelope. So knife is still in effect. The knife is still waiting for a barrier to be broken, for all subroutines on the barrier to be broken, because we did not break all subroutines on envelope. And we break all subroutines on the inner Anansi. The Anansi is the first piece of ice this run that we broke all barrier subroutines on. Don't forget, we converted it to barrier with lamb. So now Anansi goes in the bin, and we access scarcity of resources, immediately goes in the bin as well. That was a huge turn for me. Even though it bankrupted me, it also bankrupted my opponent. They went down to 4 credits, raising the envelope. And I removed my opponent's scarcity as well, so I don't have to worry about scarcity lock. This is amazing. That was a very, very good turn for me. Alright, so our opponent is forced to take 1 turn off getting money. And now we are just going to rampage over HQ. This time we're going to break all subroutines on envelope because it's so easy to do so. And, just keep farming Yusuf counters and get some dirty laundry money because we badly need it. By using the dirty laundry here, we get up to gamble threshold, so we can play show gamble here. We draw into another knife as well, which I plan to reserve for server 1. Unfortunately, our opponent scores a Kronos project here. This was one of the tricks they used in our first game, as mentioned, that completely utterly wrecked me. This deck really relies on clone chipping stuff into play, and if it's removed from the game, that's not good. Okay, so my opponent finally scored a Kronos project. Remember when I first ran the Susano and had to pay the iron price to break through it, and then the Betty side game fired? The Kronos project was in the remote all that while. They were defending the Kronos project so ardently, and well, I guess I'm happy for them. They finally got to score that Kronos project. Finally found some time to do so. It had been sitting in that remote for so long. Okay, regardless, the game's not over. Kronos project, did something, but so be it. We still are able to get by this game with just Yusuf and Lamb. Right, so what are our plans here? Here's the really troubling thing. Both envelope and IP block cost 2 virus tokens for Yusuf to break, but we only have 1. That's because we have been running HQ too much. Because of this, we kind of have to use Lamb to break both ice at least for the next run, which is bloody expensive. Because they are above Lamb's strength, it will cost us 5 credits actually, instead of the normal 2 credits to break those envelope and IP block. It's a very, very expensive breaker to use for these high strength barriers. But we have to do it because that's how we're going to get virus counters. So we spend 5 credits knifing the envelope here. I did say I wanted to reserve the knife for the remote, but the reason I chose to do this here is I badly needed to open a central server to farm Yusuf counters on. It's not sustainable to run HQ if the envelope's sitting there, because it costs me 2 virus counters every time and I'm only regaining 1 every run. The alternative was installing Knob Carry, but Knob Carry is so expensive, so I didn't really want to do that. But actually, in retrospect, that was probably the smarter play. So what I should have done last turn was probably install Knob Carry, install the second copy of Yusuf. You notice there's one in hand, and then just keep running HQ, because then I can get 3 virus counters on every successful run. So this was a mistake I made. Regardless, I would still be able to run HQ that turn. I would have still been able to steal this Nisei Mark II. So yeah, I should have chose to set up instead of expending a knife on HQ. The good thing here is that I'm going to get lots of free HQ runs, and I badly wanted that not just for the Yusuf counters, but also for the turning wheel counters. Now that I've stolen the Nisei Mark II, I'm on 4 agenda points. Stealing an Obokata wins me the game, and turning wheel allows me to get there. So that's what I'm aiming for at this point. Unfortunately, our opponent has more than enough ice in hand, so they were actually able to patch up the damage I did with knifed. So the servers are starting to lock up, and it's not looking good for Khumalo whenever servers are locked up. Now typically this isn't a problem because there are 3 central servers to run, but in this case, because my opponent's running breach domes, they don't need to ice archives at all. This is where I really wish I had security testing. Security testing will allow me to make successful runs on archives without without actually hitting breach domes, because I don't access. Now I'm going to run HQ here because they are down to 1 credit after raising the DNA tracker, so I get to see the buyers reporting in their hand once more. That's mostly running just to collect turning wheel counters, collect Yusuf counters. Our opponent isn't going to score agendas anytime soon, so we can slowly take our time to money up. Now we know that we still have 2 employee strikes left in our deck, so we don't have to worry so much about scarcity. We'll just slowly draw through our deck and overwrite the last copy of scarcity once we find our strike. There it is. Play strike, play peddler. We see I've had worse clone chip and another card. I don't really remember what that was. There's not much left in our bin, so clone chip isn't going to do much right now. Right, my opponent purchased virus counters here. This is a very smart move. It means that I have to spend big money to break through servers with Lamb. Now we are already on turn 16. Usually by this point I would be fully set up, which means having at least 2 Yusufs out, preferably 2 Lambs, and as well as something that gives me memory. There are 2 memory cards in my deck. Knob Carry is the console, which allows me to expand my memory horizontally, so I can install the second Yusuf. The other memory card is actually Progenitor. Progenitor allows me to survive purges because Yusufs hosted on Progenitor always keep 1 virus counter after a purge. So I usually would have either of those set up by now, but because I was playing so aggressively throughout this game, I never found the time to set up. After all, Knob Carry is very expensive, 5 to install. Yeah, it's a lot to pay when your lamb is already so expensive. So yeah, I think again I made a mistake of not installing Knob Carry during the turn where I knifed the HQ envelope. I was expecting HQ to remain open for some time, but that wasn't the case. So now I'm locked out on virus counters and I don't have the setup required to repeatedly run anymore. This is where the game starts slipping away from my hands. Even though I have a dominant lead in agendas, my opponent failed to rush out. They don't have an Nisei token. They are 1 agenda point to my 4, but I'm really far behind in terms of setup. That's the price I paid for running too much. So now it's finally time for me to get my Knob Carry down, but is it too little too late? I'm starting to run out of cards as well, and that is a very major concern. Because my main win condition at this point is stealing the final Obokata, but that's not happening if I go below 4 cards. So that's something to keep in mind as our opponent continues icing up. R&D is now 3 deep and they have the money to rest all the ice in the world. I need to get the second Yusuf down so that I can at least sustain breaking IP block. It costs 2 virus counters, so if I gain 3 virus counters on each run, 2 from the Yusufs and 1 from the Knob Carry, I might have a chance. But my opponent's not going to give me a chance here. They install double advance, so I can't really contest that remote because I'm very afraid of the Marcus Batty in the remote. If they win the Batty side game on the remote, they will send me to archives. Again, I can't jack out. I have to access the 2 breach domes in there, and that's very, very bad news. I'm really freaking out over chat here because there didn't seem to be a viable line of play at all. Running HQ seems fine, but I don't know what ice I will hit. 2 unrest ice means that I can potentially hit 2 non-barriers, which I can't break. R&D, same thing. There might be two non-barriers. If the outermost ice is a non-barrier, the innermost DNA tracker cannot be broken with LAM. And the remote, same thing. So yeah, my opponent has gotten me in a very tough spot. Regardless, I have to pick a server to run, and HQ was my attack vector of choice. I first saw Kakugo, which I can easily break with 2 credits from LAM, so that made me a bit happy. Even though I had to ditch 1 card to Kakugo net damage, it means that I can get through the server no matter what, because whatever the inner ice is, I can convert it to a barrier and break it with LAM. So yeah, I'm pretty happy to see that HQ is still not all barriers. I mean, not all non-barriers, I should say. My opponent shows DNA tracker on HQ, that goes down to LAM, and I'm gonna get 3 virus counters here. I see a bias reporting as always, but then I quickly realize, hey wait, the Kakugo on HQ, it's an end run. Okay, we're just gonna run HQ 3 times, get turning wheel counters, and then go in for 1 big deep dig on R&D. So that became my new win condition because my opponent exposed an end run as the outer ice on one of their central servers. Unfortunately, they have the perfect counter to a deep turning wheel dig in the form of Biovolt. You see in the remote, they have 2 advanced cards, so obviously one of them is an advanced upgrade. Biovolt is, I believe, the only upgrade that can be advanced aside from what's that called? It's that HB upgrade that can be put on archives. I forgot what's its name, sorry about that, but basically it can only be put on archives, so that can't be it. So obviously that's a Biovolt, and that puns me because after spending turning wheel counters, my opponent just has to res and use Biovolt in order to deny me a deep dig. So yeah, suddenly my win condition doesn't seem like it's going to work anymore. Turning wheel is going to fizzle at the whim of my opponent's Biovolt. At this point, I have to decide whether I want to try to bait out the Biovolt by running R&D and attempting a deep dig, or whether I should run server 1 to try to force out the Biovolt. Both ways it's tough. There's a DNA tracker on R&D, there's a Susano on the remote, so either way, either server would cost 7 credits to break. I have no money cards left, so the only thing I can do to break those ice is to click for credits. I could Dirty Laundry to archives, but as I mentioned, that would activate Breach Domes and would put me out of range of stealing an Obo Carter. So here I'm going to click for credits, and with the bad publicity I'll be able to make a successful run on R&D after breaking IP block using Yusuf and breaking DNA tracker using LAM. Now I'm going to expand 2 turning wheel counters to force out the Biovolt here. Felt like I had to do that, no choice about that. So Biovolt was forced out and I clicked for a credit. At this point, I hope that the card in server 1 isn't a Nisei Mark II. Guess what? It's a Nisei Mark II. I'm screwed. Right? Because that's another essentially end the run, essentially another Biovolt that they have access to. So if I try to go for another turning wheel run on R&D, they're just going to use Nisei Mark II again. The reason I went for R&D as opposed to server 1, it might seem like server 1's actually easier to run because there's 1 fewer ice there. The problem with server 1 is that there's 1 upgrade there. If it's a freaking Batty that I lose the side game to, that's it, right? That's it. I'm gonna be forced into archives and eat up 2 breach domes, which I don't want to. Right? So because of that, I want to avoid the remote as much as possible. I'm gonna run R&D here and see the Kakugo on R&D. So basically, my hit points are limited with only 4 hit points left and no way to run R&D or HQ without taking net damage. It means that I won't be able to steal Obo Carters from anywhere aside from server 1. So I have to decide whether I want to just go Hail Mary on Centrals or whether I want to lock down server 1 and just keep taking credits and running server 1. The issue with that is, again, with only 1 LAM in play, I don't see myself breaking through Susano plus a non-barrier on the remote. And given that they have shown a lot of barriers on the Centrals, it's highly unlikely that the remote ice is a barrier. Now, some of you might be wondering, why did you not play LAM when you had 2 copies of LAM in your hand? You could have had double LAM out in play, which allows you to break 2 barriers in a turn. My issue with that line is that with no long-term economy on the board at all, this deck doesn't run Consume, and I have no drip economy whatsoever. There is no way I'm going to be able to sustain breaking ice with double LAM. LAM is way too expensive. So there's absolutely no way I would have won using double LAM. I'll be clicking for credits all day, and my opponent would win well before I get enough money to break 2 pieces of ice. So yeah, I had to go for Yusuf because it's far more efficient to break ice that way. It's just unfortunate that I ran out of steam so early because there's just too much net damage around, and Street Peddler, also mills your deck, which doesn't help. So I'm going to attempt a deep dig again and fail again because my opponent fires the Nisei Mark II, and they start chaining Niseis once again. As soon as I get enough resources to make a run, they end that run with Nisei and then score yet another Nisei, putting me in a very miserable position where I'm forced to just click for credits and try to make a run but never ever actually make the run. So yeah, the game just goes on very quickly from here. Given I have very limited number of runs left, thanks to Kakugo, there's really not much I can do in this position. Even Obokater's out of reach now, so basically my win comes down to stealing 2 agendas in a row that are not Obokater's, which is a pretty tough shout. I'm gonna attempt to run HQ here to get some Yusuf counters back. 3 Yusuf counters actually. I see a Mirage and then a Nancy. So yeah, no agendas in their hand, they're all in R&D. And they're about to win the game by double advancing what seems like an Obokater. So I'm just going to Hail Mary Archives and lose on flatline anyway. You won't get the satisfaction of scoring out your agenda. Alright, so what did we learn from this game? Long-term economy is not there, right? With the consume imp variant, typically Khumalo has a very strong late game. Consume will just sustain your economy forever as you trash stuff from running. This deck just cannot sustain its economy. The real sustenance comes from bad publicity from mining accidents. I managed to get 3 out in fairly short order, but my opponent wisely paid into the mining accidents most of the time, only giving me 1 bad pub for the entire game. That was not enough to sustain all my runs. The biggest mistake, as I mentioned, was the envelope run here. Right? I knifed the envelope here, thinking that it would open the path to an empty HQ, allowing me to get 1 Yusuf counter, 1 turning wheel counter, and a Khumalo, possibly a Khumalo trigger every single click. It also allows me to play Dirty Laundry into HQ. My mistake was, firstly, I did not realize that they would have enough ice in their hand to patch up the HQ server. The second mistake was I did not see the line of play where I could set up instead. Instead of paying 1 for the knife and then 5 credits to break the envelope here because it's strength 3, bloody hell. I needed to break all subroutines, so I had to use Lamb here. That was very expensive, right? I ended the run with 8 credits and started the run with 13 credits. It's a 5 credit difference, which I could have used instead to pay for the knob carry, which would have, which was a more long-term solution. So the correct answer here would actually be install knob carry, install Yusuf, and then probably run HQ here. I would probably use 1 Yusuf counter, take 1 net damage, and hope that net damage hits the Dirty Laundry. I would have installed the Yusuf and the knob carry, so the only 2 cards remaining in my hand were Knife and Dirty Laundry. If the net damage hits the Dirty Laundry, I would end the run with the Knife in my hand, and I would get 3 virus counters, which would allow me to sustain HQ runs. So that would have been the correct line of play. I would still have been able to run HQ indefinitely, but the thing is, I don't lose the Knife. So very important to have the Knife available for me to break down server 1, or perhaps break the DNA trackers that my opponent would put on HQ and R&D later on. In the end, I had to install the knob carry anyway. As you saw here, the knob carry came down sooner or later, and since it came down later, it wasn't able to pay out as much. I still have to pay the 5 credit install cost, but it just wasn't doing that much. Yeah, so the biggest problem I find is with this deck is that it requires too much setup. As if your breakers don't cost a lot to use as it is. Knob carry is a very, very expensive console, and I just couldn't find the time to install it most of the time. I had 1 opportunity to do so, I didn't capitalize on that, and as a result, my opponent was able to lock me out by putting an expensive non-barrier ice on every single server. Tracker, Susano. Big mistake, and it's just not a very good matchup. Khumalo doesn't really like Glacier decks. I didn't really get to use Khumalo's ability too much this game, because I just couldn't run that often, and I couldn't break big ice efficiently. Knife was supposed to help me show up that weakness, but yeah, my knives were not put to the best use. I was breaking. I did kill an Anansi, but I also killed an envelope, which was basically on the bottom of the pecking order. There were much better fish to fry like Kugels and all these big ice. So yeah, you live and learn. Unfortunate that I couldn't find an Obo Carter, but I think this matchup was just not very favored for Khumalo at all. Doesn't help that I was misplaying it quite a bit as well. Right, that took a very long time to cast. We still have another game to showcase. Alright, game number 2 today is going to be against Tier 3, playing Titan. Okay, this is a fairly marginal hand, but we keep it. There's lots of reasons for that. Sure gamble is money, inject is draw, and employee strike ensures that our opponent's first Atlas will not have a token on it unless they go for the turn 1 Audacity play, which is very audacious. Well, it seems like they almost went for it, but instead, no, they scored a hostile takeover. So, right? As you saw on the chat box, I typed it at the start of the game. I was suspecting that my opponent was on Kill Titan. Well, the thing is, pure Fast Advanced Titan used to be a thing, but with the most wanted list, seeing Clone Chip Clot becoming a lot more rampant in the meta, I don't think pure Fast Advanced Titan cuts it anymore. So yeah, if you want to play a good Titan deck nowadays, it probably has some sort of kill component that punishes players who play too aggressively early on. So because of that, we don't actually want to be running that early on. Instead, we'll just passively stop our opponent from getting away with Project Atlas by using Employee Strike. So we're just going to play a bunch of cards here. The Clone Chip here is pretty important because there's a breaker in our bin that we can fetch using Clone Chip. Our opponent Arc Lockdowns our breaker in the bin. The lamb that we injected is now removed from the game. They found it was worth it to pay 3 credits and 2 clicks just to remove our lamb from the game. Arc Lockdown, of course, used in Titan to remove Clot. Usually it's Clot tech. If you are relying too much on Clone Chip to recur Clot and your Clot is in the bin, well, it's targetable by Arc Lockdown. In this matchup, my opponent's not expecting Clot, so they are simply using Arc Lockdown to delay me from finding a breaker. Lamb, of course, will completely shut down Titan because it threatens to break all their ice and they don't have many of it to begin with. Right, so that's a fairly okay move by my opponent, but well, they do know that I'm running 3 copies of Lamb, so I will eventually find one. I'm gonna inject into double Street Peddler and that should find me my breaker. No, it doesn't. Even though I drew like 10 cards off the back of that, none of them were breakers. Both Street Peddlers only found money cards and events, so all I'm gonna get is a Liberator account from one Peddler and a Daily Cast from another. My opponent installs a card here. Usually Titan doesn't install naked remotes here, so that's very questionable. That's either a Rashida, which seems somewhat likely, or it could be a Project Atlas. That's not something that I want my opponent to sneak out. So the problem with running a Project Atlas here obviously is the threat of hard-hitting news. As I mentioned, I'm expecting this to be a kill deck, and one way in which the Titan player can establish the credit differential to learn hard-hitting news is to play a card like Too Big to Fail, which they just played. So they have the credit differential lead, 12 credits to my 6. That's a big problem, so we'll fix that with the economy cards from our peddlers. So even though we didn't find breakers, we find money, and money is going to help us avoid the hard-hitting news here. So at the start of my turn, I liberate the daily cast from one peddler, and I'm going to get the liberator account from the other peddler. Now normally I just install this outright, which will cost 5 credits. However, I can get some discounts. Because my opponent has 2 bad publicity from the hostile takeover and the Too Big to Fail, I can actually install the Liberator account while in the middle of this server 2 run. This allows me to offset the cost of Liberator account by using my bad publicity, so I cheat it in for a cheaper amount, and I do steal an agenda off the back of it. So that was really good to see. And with that, I'm able to spend the remainder of my clicks taking money, and whoa! How did I get so much money? I have more money than my opponent now. So they can't land the hard-hitting news. Instead, they're going to score an Atlas without the counter because of Employee Strike. So this is very good for us. This means that without the threat of hard-hitting news in their hand, because the hand is now empty, we can play the turning wheel and start rampaging on the R&D. We first see a fast track, which we definitely hammer here. We don't want them to get access to their agendas. We're just going to keep running R&D and see yet another card. It's a global food that we steal. So now we are up 4 points to 3, and we are in the lead because they don't have an Atlas counter, but they triple advance something on the HQ. What sorcery is this? I was trying to figure out what ice that could be. It's certainly not Space Ice. Titan doesn't have time to advance Space Ice in most of their games, so it had to be either Hortum or Morcelus, one of their code gates. So, well, we are not going to run into that until we find our Lamb. Once we do find our Lamb, we can make very quick work of whatever HQ Ice there is. Because advancement counters do not actually boost the strengths or subroutines of the Wayland code gates. So, you know, any of those ice will cost the same amount to break at 0 advancements as 3 advancements. Alright, we do find our Lamb, which is really good to see, but we are not going to show it yet. We are going to keep running R&D here. We see first an Economic Warfare, trash for free. This is a matchup that's really good for Khumalo because there's so many 0 to trash operations. Economic Warfare, Fast Track, Audacity, all these in the bin. And this allows us to actually effectively multi-access R&D because we get to see many cards every single turn. But we are stopped by the Baltic Labor here. That's something we can't deal with because we haven't found our Yusuf yet. We have been really bad on breakers, good on money, good on turning wheel, but bad on breakers. So that's a big problem. Without viruses, we are not able to deal with cards like Baltic Labor. Our opponent keeps drawing up here, trying to break my R&D lock, which is a good idea, but I found my Lamb, so I can run HQ now and, you know, destroy whatever's in their hand. We are going to break the Morcelus, and even though it's pretty expensive, I'm fine doing that because I know I have a knife in my hand that can deal with this Morcelus here. We are going to see Arc Lockdown, which we don't care about, and Preemptive Action. Another 0 to trash card. We are very happy to see those. That goes in the bin. Every card trash with Khumalo counts because if we can keep their hand size down, we will delay their Audacities. Audacity requires you to have 3 cards in your hand before playing. So if we can keep them at a low hand size, we can, you know, neuter the threat of Audacity. Alright, we draw into even more money cards here, so we just take money and we not have to worry about hard hitting news as our opponent scores the second hostile takeover, evening the scoreline at 4 apiece. Now, here's the tricky part. Do I fire the knife here? I don't think there are agendas in hand, so firing knife doesn't seem that good. Why not run R&D instead? Force them to rest the ice so I can decide which server to knife. In this case, I saw another Morcelus here, so that's good to know. And I'm going to see 2 cards. I'm going to use Turning Wheel to see 2 cards here. The reason I'm using Turning Wheel here is to make sure that in case the top card is a card that I can steal or trash, I want to make sure that the second card on the deck is not a card that they can win with. If it's a Project Atlas, for example, giving my opponent a Project Atlas in their hand is bad. What I want to do is to make sure that there are no agendas in their hand, and I can do that by seeing cards, lots of cards off R&D, giving them ice, giving them operations, but not agendas. So the first card was a Hortum, second card is a Hortum, so I know a lot of ice is coming my opponent's way. I draw into a Mining Accident here. Now, usually against Titan, you ditch Mining Accidents because, well, they already give you bad pub, naturally, with hostile takeovers, but also because generally the ice isn't taxing enough, so, you know, the game's not going to last long enough that you can make full use of the bad pub. They usually just win by the time you reach turn 10 or something. But given the ice that I've just seen on R&D, and given that my opponent has Morcelus in place on Centrals, I think I could definitely use some bad pub here. Because with so many code gates, I'm going to have to convert them all with Lamb and break them for 7 credits. So every bad pub is going to be useful here, and my opponent's not filthy rich, so this Mining Accident is going to hurt. So I'm actually going to play this Mining Accident here, and surprisingly they actually paid into it. They've spent all 5 credits, denying me the bad pub. So Theatre really playing for the late game here, trying to wipe me down on money, potentially keeping their hard-hitting news win condition alive. Unfortunately for them, I still have a lot of money cards in my hand, so I decided to knife the HQ Morcelus because it had an end the run subroutine on it with the advancements, and also HQ is generally a better server to attack. Didn't really see much on HQ. I'm going to rerun again, see a Hortum again, and show a gamble to end my turn. Now my opponent is very poor right now, so they can't really defend HQ. They keep drawing up, but this means I'm just going to repeatedly run HQ here. HQ is relatively free now, but I also want to balance running HQ with drawing through my deck. I need a Yusuf so badly. I want to start chalking up virus counters so that I can break ice for cheap, but also so that I can use Khumalo's ability on things that are not zero cost stuff. And I finally can do that. The most important card to trash would be Biotic Labor. I knew they drew one earlier on. I can't let them have it. We Dirty Laundry and see a Hortum, right? So we'll just keep doing that. But our opponent bamboozles us by scoring a hostile takeover here. This is scary. They are now on 5 points. They can win by fast advancing a Project Atlas, and they have the money to do so. I know they have a Biotic Labor in hand. The best I can do is hope that they don't have the winning Atlas in hand. So what I'm going to do here is fairly straightforward. Assuming they have to draw the Atlas from R&D to win, the safest play would be to spend all my turning wheel counters accessing cards from R&D. Then with my remaining clicks, I can run HQ repeatedly in case the Atlas is in hand. So you're going to see me repeatedly run HQ first to chalk up turning wheel counters. I see Biotic Labor, I see Hortum. I'm going to play a sure gamble first because I'm still aware that my opponent can potentially win by landing a hard-hitting news into kill. So I'm going to play a gamble first before breaking the Merciless on R&D. I'm going to see 3 cards here. 3 additional cards here, total of 4 cards. I could win outright. First card is a high-profile target. Yep, they are definitely on kill. We don't bother with trashing high-profile target because as long as we stay ahead on economy, they can't kill us. It will take them 2 turns to kill. First turn to land hard-hitting news. Second turn to land the high-profile target. There are better things to fry with our Khumalo ability. I'm looking at fast advance cards here. I'm looking at fast tracks here. Those have to go. High-profile target is a useless card that I can let my opponent draw. Every useless card on R&D is important because it buys me time to chalk up more turning wheel counters so that when I next run R&D, I can see more fresh cards. So I want to leave as many useless cards on R&D as possible because they'll have to then spend precious clicks actually drawing through these useless cards. Right, so we leave the useless high-profile target on R&D. Second card is Dedication Ceremony. This is not a useless card. This is a fast advance card that goes well with Reconstruction Contract. I'm kind of forced to trash it here. With Freedom, I'm able to trash it using 1 virus counter, and this is why I really wanted Yusuf. The third card is a Project Atlas, which I happily steal, and the fourth card is a Boom. Now, this is something that you reflexively trash, but if you apply the same logic to high-profile target, you realize that there's no reason to trash the Boom here. It's no threat at all, and you want Tier 3 here to waste a click drawing into the Boom, which is totally useless to them. So I'm actually going to leave it on R&D even though it's only 1 to trash. So on their turn, they mandatory draw the high-profile target. They don't win, they don't have the winning Atlas in hand. Their click 1 was draw into the useless Boom. So yeah, they're just wasting their time drawing cards that I know are not Project Atlases, that are not win conditions for them. So now their hands full of useless cards, they're just going to take money and maybe ice HQ. At this point, they have to be worried about me sniping the Biotic Labor from their hand. If they don't ice HQ here, I just keep running the hand and kill their Biotic Labor. So smart of Theatre here to put the Hortum on HQ. I of course have to run HQ to force it to be rezzed. I could break it here using Lamb, but what I want to do is to save my Lamb, the barrier conversion ability, to run R&D. Since they have drawn the Boom already, I know that the next card on R&D is an unseen card. It could be the game-winning Atlas for them. I need to lock down R&D. So I can't afford to break the Hortum here. I'm just gonna have to jack out, or rather let Hortum end the run, and they get their 1 credit from Hortum firing. I'm gonna do that again because I want turning wheel counters. As I said, running R&D to see 1 card is pretty bad because you would usually want to either trash or steal the top card that you see. There are lots of trashable cards in Titan's deck. So ideally, you want to see 2 cards so that, there's a good chance that one of those cards remains on R&D for them to mandatory draw into, so that you can be sure they won't win the game next turn. So that's the reason for running HQ twice, giving my opponent 2 Hortum triggers. Then I can then run R&D here to see 2 cards with turning wheel. I make this a stim hack run because the 2 cards in my hand are useless. I can afford to pitch them to brain damage. At this point, I need to make sure that I'm out of hard-hitting news range, so Stim Hack allows me to do that. So I'm going to see 2 cards here. The first card is Economic Warfare. Oof. This one's a marginal card. It's not a high priority card like Fast Track or Audacity, but yeah, you don't really want to lose 4 credits into a hard-hitting news here. On the other hand, I would like them to draw into more useless cards, and Economic Warfare is kind of a useless card outside of the hard-hitting news threat. I really had to think about this one. In the end, I went with the trash. Second card is a dedication ceremony that I can't touch, so they can draw it. Right? Let's see if that ends up being a mistake. I still have the credit lead because I Stim hacked into R&D. So I didn't have to pay to break the Morseless. But I don't have many more R&D runs left in me. I need to seal up the game sooner rather than later, and I know that my opponent is looking for the agendas as much as I am, and they're all in R&D. So knowing that, I'm going to make the exact same play. I'm going to bump myself into HQ, get some turning wheel counters so that I can run R&D to see yet another 2 cards. Now this time, things are nicer because I've chalked up enough Yusuf counters to break Morseless using Yusuf instead of paying 5 with Lamb. So I can break Morseless here. Enough virus counters actually to break all but 1 set routine. I'm going to let the net damage subroutine fire because there's nothing much relevant in my hand. And it fires and it hits the clone chip. And I see a Morseless on top. I actually intended to spend 2 turning wheel counters here to multi-access, but I forgot. So I guess we'll just do it this turn instead. Now, that was a very ideal situation because the net damage sniped off the card I needed the least in clone chip. Progenitor Yusuf is actually useful here in my hand because I could potentially install both, and that gives me double mileage on Yusuf, allowing me to break Morseless a lot more frequently than right now. Okay. I'm going to run HQ and then run Archives here. This is so that I can get up to 4 turning wheel counters, so I access 3 cards of R&D. The reason I'm running Archives here is to get more Yusuf counters. Firstly, I think there might be agendas in the bin that I can auto-win the game with anyway. That turned out not to be the case, but even then, I'm still gaining a Yusuf counter, so if my opponent put a barrier on R&D, well, I can easily break it with Yusuf. Obviously, it's not a barrier, it's going to be the Morseless that I just saw off the top of R&D last turn. I can't afford to break them both, I can only break one because, they are not barriers. So I'm going to let one fire, and I'm going to break the other one with Lamb. This means I'm taking a tag, but that's fine. I can clear the tag at the end of my turn. The 1 net damage is fine as well, I guess, and letting them gain 1 credit is not the end of the world when they're so poor as they are right now. In fact, they are out of range of scoring an Atlas using Baltic Labor because, they spend money installing all these code gates. So we're going to see a bunch of cards here, including the game-winning Global Food Initiative. Right, post-mortem. What can I say? This game was a lot closer than it really should have been. This was a fairly good matchup for me. As you saw, Khumalo did serious work this game. So many zero-cost cards that I could trash even without Yusuf's presence. So yeah, it was supposed to be a good matchup, but the combination of my opponent finding all 3 hostile takeovers and me not having a very good setup in terms of viruses. Ideally, I'd like to have 2 Yusufs out, but I just never found the time to install both Yusuf. That meant that I just couldn't really keep up. Towards the end, I was having trouble sustaining pressure on HQ and R&D because they got to a point where they had 2 code gates on each server, so I had to start letting ice fire. Thankfully, I managed to close out the game before they transitioned into the glacier stage. But yeah, so all in all, interesting game. But I think the one thing that really saved me this game was the turn 2 employee strike. This was everything. This employee strike was everything because they could have fast advance and Audacity here. Had they done so, the Atlas counter they would have been absolutely key in, just pushing them towards the end game. You bet that at various points in time, timely use of an Atlas counter would have just won them the game. Like towards the end, if they had an Atlas counter anytime during the mid to late game, they would just outright win by tutoring the final Atlas for the game with Baltic Labor. So they were forced to play slow, Glacier style, because they couldn't reliably tutor up for their Project Atlas, and that's why Employee Strike is still really good even in this day and age. Now, our opponent's Arc Lockdown seemed very questionable. In the end, it actually worked because, it did delay my LAM, but once I found the LAM, the game became a lot easier because I was able to, just keep placing pressure on Centrals until they managed to double ice both servers. So the mid game was when I truly shone. With my 4 bad publicity, 3 to 4 bad publicity, I was able to run often, knife their ice, and just cause a lot of destruction. So very interesting game, and it was very close as well. Titan can usually get very out of hand if they have a very good early start, but thankfully the Employee Strike meant that they had a very slow start, and as a result, I was able to capitalize on their servers, which were less well guarded. Right, that's all I have for both videos. It took quite a while. This video is going on for very long, but thanks for watching. I hope you enjoy the increased amount of gameplay, and I hope you enjoy the more in-depth analysis as I'm doing voiceover commentary on videos, so that way I can pause whenever there's something to explain. If you have any more questions about the games or any suggestions on how I could have played better, leave them in the comment section. Otherwise, hope you enjoy Freedom Khumalo as always. It's a blast playing this runner ID. Happy night running. See you next time.